My name is Reese Calloway. I'm 28 years old. And the second my brother-in-law pushed back his chair and cleared his throat like he was about to give a toast, I felt the temperature in the room drop in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside. It was Christmas Eve. My mother had spent 2 days cooking. The table looked the way it always looked in December. The good china, the tall candles, the little cloth napkins folded into fan shapes that nobody ever used correctly. My father sat at the head of the table with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. My sister was refilling her wine. Her husband, who had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon and laughing too loudly at everything he himself said, stood up with his glass raised. To Reese, he said, grinning in the particular way people grin when they've already decided the joke is funny before they've told it. Still out here living the dream. Freelancing from her couch in that little apartment. Writing instruction manuals that nobody reads. My sister laughed. Not a surprised laugh. A practiced one. My mother smiled into her plate like she was embarrassed for me, which was its own kind of cruelty, because it wasn't embarrassment. It was performance. My father said nothing, which was what he always did. He let silence stand in for neutrality, as if not objecting was the same as not participating. My brother-in-law wasn't finished. Come on, Reese. When are you going to get a real job? You're almost 30. He said almost 30 the way people say almost out of time. Their daughter, who was 7 and sitting next to me, looked up from her green beans with the honest confusion that only children manage. What's wrong with Aunt Reese's job? Nobody answered her. I set my fork down very quietly. I picked up my napkin and folded it the way it had come, which took longer than it should have. Then I looked around the table at every face, which is something I had never done before, because usually when this happened I looked at the wall, or the floor, or my own hands. My mother was watching me with that careful, waiting expression she wore when she wanted to see how much damage the moment would do. My sister had found something very interesting about the edge of her wine glass. My father was finally looking at me, but with the hopeful blankness of a man who believed that if he appeared calm enough, the situation would agree to be calm too. I said, very clearly, that I would not be doing this again. Not next Christmas, not Easter, not anybody's birthday. I said I was done sitting at a table, where being the target was considered entertainment. My brother-in-law laughed like I was joking. I wasn't joking. I picked up my coat from the hook by the door, told my niece I loved her, and walked out into the cold. Tell me where you're watching from, because I want to know how far this story travels. And while you're thinking about that, let me tell you what happened in the 3 months after I got in my car and drove away from that dinner table. I didn't cry on the drive home. I got all the way inside my apartment, took off my boots, put water on for tea, and stood at my kitchen window for a long time watching the snow settle on the fire escape railing. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and cried until I ran out of it. Not because of what my brother-in-law said. I had heard variations of that joke for 6 years. Not because my sister laughed. She always laughed. The thing that undid me was the realization, fully and finally, that I had been showing up to that table, my entire adult life hoping something would be different, and it never was, and somewhere between setting my fork down and putting on my coat, I had understood that it never would be. Not because they couldn't change, but because they had never seen any reason to. My phone started within 20 minutes. My mother first, then my sister, then my father. I turned the screen face down and let it go. The voicemails came overnight. My mother's was indignant and sad at the same time, the two emotions she always used in combination the way a cook uses salt and acid. Reese, this is ridiculous, Mark was joking. You know how he gets. My father's was shorter and worse. You embarrassed your mother by leaving like that. My sister's came at 11:30 at night and sounded like she'd been crying, but the tears were aimed inward, not at me. She didn't say she was sorry. She said, "You always make everything harder than it needs to be." I listened to that one 3 times. Not because it hurt, but because every time I played it, I needed it to keep sounding as clear as it did. Some people train themselves their whole lives to make you doubt what you heard. Listening to the evidence is the only way to stay sane. I went to work the next morning, which was a Thursday, sitting at my desk in the corner of my apartment with a mug of coffee and a manuscript on my screen. I wrote technical documentation for software and infrastructure companies, the kind of writing that turned complex systems into language that a person could actually follow. My family called it writing instruction manuals. Nobody reads. The companies that hired me called it the difference between a product that worked and one that didn't. I had been freelancing for 4 years, and the work was good, and the clients were consistent, and none of that had ever mattered at Christmas dinner. I did not call anyone back. My best friend Jade, who was a UX researcher at a tech firm downtown and the most practically wise person I had ever met, appeared at my apartment 2 days after Christmas, with Thai food and the look on her face she got when she had already formed a theory about a situation and was waiting for me to catch up. "They did it again," she said, in the same tone she might use to describe a software bug that had been flagged and ignored for the 3rd time. I told her all of it: the toast, the laughter, the 7-year-old's unanswered question, the drive home, the voicemails. Jade listened the way she always did, which was entirely, without filling in the pauses. When I finished, she said only one thing: "What do you actually want to happen? Not what should happen. Not what would keep the peace. What did I want?" I thought about it for a long time before I answered. "I want to stop going to events where I know I'm going to be handled like a joke and going anyway because leaving feels worse than staying." Jade nodded like that was a complete and reasonable sentence. "Then stop going." So I did. I blocked the family group chat. I set my mother's number to go straight to voicemail. I turned off the read receipts on every thread. I spent New Year's Eve with Jade and her partner cooking a ridiculous amount of food for 3 people and watching a movie we'd both already seen, and it was the first New Year's in 6 years. I didn't spend half of in my head composing the apology I would eventually have to give for something that hadn't been my fault. In January, I started sleeping better. That surprised me more than anything. My work improved too, in the way that work improves when the background noise you've been so accustomed to that you stop noticing it finally goes quiet. I'd been circling a larger project for months, a full documentation suite for a logistics software company that was scaling fast and needed a senior technical writer to build their knowledge base from the ground up. It was the kind of contract that would have felt too big 6 months earlier, when the voice in my head still carried my mother's particular frequency. But I applied, and I did the skills assessment, and I did not preemptively apologize for my rates the way I used to. They offered me the contract in the 2nd week of January. The number in the email was larger than anything I had invoiced in a single year before. I sat with that for a moment. Then I made tea and got to work. The messages from my family had shifted in tone by mid-January. The early ones were reactive hurt feelings, accusations of overreacting, variations of "you're tearing this family apart." The later ones were quieter and harder to read. My father sent a message that said only, "I hope you're doing okay." My sister sent a link to an article about conflict resolution between siblings and added no context. My mother sent a photograph of the Christmas ornament I'd made in 2nd grade, which had been hanging on their tree every year since, and wrote nothing below it. That one, I had to put my phone away for an hour. What they never said was what happened, what Mark said, what they did. The messages addressed the silence but not the source of it. They wanted me back at the table. They didn't want to talk about why I had left it. Then, on a cold Tuesday in late January, I got a phone call from a lawyer named Patricia Osei. She had a calm and deliberate voice, and she got to the point without preamble. She represented the estate of my grandmother on my mother's side, Dorothea Wills, who had passed the previous spring. The family had gathered for the funeral, and I remembered my mother crying in a way that had looked genuine, and my aunt arguing with the funeral director about flower arrangements, and my uncle taking calls in the parking lot, and my niece asking me what heaven smelled like. I had stayed 3 days, and helped clean out my grandmother's kitchen, and not spoken about any of it since. Patricia told me there was an estate matter that had taken longer than expected to finalize, and that she needed me to come in. She was careful about the details on the phone, but she said one thing clearly: there are provisions in the will that are specific to you, not to the family broadly. To you, Reese. I remember standing at my kitchen counter with the phone in my hand, looking at the draft manuscript open on my laptop, thinking about the last real conversation I'd had with my grandmother. She had been in the hospital for a short stay the winter before she died. I had driven up on a Saturday and we'd spent the afternoon together, and she had held my hand and told me that I was the one she didn't worry about, because I understood that things worth keeping required care. I thought she meant it as a compliment about my personality. I had thanked her and driven home. It turned out she had meant something more specific. The estate meeting was at Patricia Osei's office, a quiet building downtown, with thick carpet and a fish tank in the waiting area. I arrived 5 minutes early. My mother arrived 2 minutes after me and stopped in the doorway when she saw me, with an expression I didn't entirely know how to read. Something between relief and calculation, which is a combination that is mostly calculation. My aunt came in behind her. Then my uncle, then my mother's other sister, who lived 2 hours away and had driven in that morning. Nobody said much in the waiting room. My mother asked how I was. I said fine. She looked at me for a moment, the way people look at a door they're not sure is locked. Patricia Osei had a conference table and printed documents, and the efficient manner of someone who understood that the people in her office were usually already under strain and didn't need ceremony added to it. She explained the estate overview. Most personal belongings had already been distributed. The remaining asset was a duplex property my grandmother had owned since the 1970s, currently generating rental income, fully paid off, and worth significantly more than anyone in the room had apparently expected. She explained that the property had been placed in a trust before my grandmother's death. My aunt asked who the trustee was. Patricia looked at me. I had not known. I want to be clear about that. I had not known anything about a trust. I had not asked my grandmother for anything, ever, because she was my grandmother and I loved her, and that was the whole story. But in the room, at that table, watching my mother's face go very still, and my aunt turn in her chair toward my uncle, and my uncle's jaw tighten the way jaws tighten when someone receives news they had already been spending, I understood something I should have understood months earlier. The condolences and the silence and the careful management of my place in that family had not been grief. It had been waiting. Patricia explained the terms. The trust generated rental income. The property had been appraised. As trustee, I held discretionary authority over any distributions. There were no automatic payments. My grandmother had written explicitly that she wanted the asset managed by someone who wouldn't mistake generosity for obligation. My mother started to speak. Patricia was not finished. She slid an envelope across the table. She said my grandmother had left a letter for me to read privately, and that she was authorized to share only the legal summary at this stage, which was that no one in the room had any claim to the trust assets without my agreement. My aunt said there had to be some misunderstanding. There wasn't. I took the envelope home before I opened it. I sat on my couch in the quiet of my apartment with the letter in my lap for a few minutes before I unfolded it. My grandmother's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a woman who had been a bookkeeper for 30 years and still balanced her checkbook in pencil. She wrote that she had watched me for a long time. She wrote that she had seen the way my mother's family treated love like a resource to be rationed, and she had always been ashamed that she hadn't intervened more when I was younger. She wrote that she knew the property might create conflict, and that she had thought about that carefully and decided to make me the trustee anyway, because I was the one she trusted to do something useful with it rather than something urgent. Then she wrote the sentence that I read 4 times before I could continue. She wrote, "I have watched you absorb cruelty quietly your whole life and call it keeping the peace. That is not peace. That is just silence with better manners. You have earned something that has nothing to do with this property, and I hope you already know what it is. But just in case you need someone to say it plainly, you are not the family's problem to solve. You are a person. Act accordingly." I didn't cry right away. I made dinner first, because I needed to do something with my hands. Then I sat at my kitchen table and cried for a long time, not because of the property or the money or the legal documents, because my grandmother had looked directly at what had happened to me and named it without softening the edges, and that was a thing I had needed someone to do for most of my adult life. The phone calls started the next morning in earnest. My mother called twice before 8. My aunt called and left a voicemail that began with "sweetheart" in the particular tone that means, "This conversation is not for you, it is for me." My uncle sent a text that was 3 paragraphs long and explained the current financial situation involving a home equity loan and a business my family had started 2 years ago that was not doing what they had projected it would do. My mother's other sister, the one who had driven 2 hours, left a message that was almost entirely silence, interrupted by crying. By 3 in the afternoon, I had 14 missed calls. By the end of the week, I had lost count. I did not answer any of them. I read the texts and set them down, and went back to my contract work and made my coffee, and ran my regular miles, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, which was a thing I had stopped doing at some point in my mid-20s, and had only recently learned again. It was Jade who finally said what I had been thinking but hadn't said out loud. You know, if you'd been working a corporate job with a 401k and a title, none of this would have happened differently. They would have still laughed at Christmas dinner. And they'd still be calling now. The asset is just the part that made the math visible. She was right. The calls weren't about remorse. They were about arithmetic. I had never been a person to my mother's family. I had been a variable in a calculation they were running, and the variable had turned out to be load-bearing in a way they hadn't planned for. My sister called on a Saturday morning in February. Not a voicemail. A real call that I almost sent to voicemail on reflex, and then, for reasons I still don't fully understand, picked up. She sounded different than the December voicemail. Less performed, quieter. She asked if I would meet her somewhere. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in the back booth with both hands around a mug, looking the way people look when they've spent a night not sleeping. That was not the first such night in a row. She said she was sorry. I said nothing. She said she meant it. I said nothing. She looked up. Then she told me the truth, which I think cost her something, because telling the truth in our family was always treated as a form of disloyalty. She told me that Mark had been stressed about money since the previous spring, that he had been difficult to live with, and that she had been managing him the way our mother had always managed things, by finding someone lower in the room to absorb the tension. That Christmas Eve, he had been drinking since before I arrived, and she had known something was going to happen, and she had not done anything to stop it because she had learned a long time ago that it was better to be standing next to the target than to be the target. She said, looking at the table, that our mother had actually suggested the toast. Not the exact words, but she'd said to Mark, before dinner, maybe lighten things up with a little joke about Reese's situation. My sister said she hadn't known until after I left, and they'd been arguing since. I asked her one question. If none of this had happened with the estate, would you be sitting here right now? She didn't look away, which I respected. She said, probably not like this. I think I would have eventually called. But not this soon. And not this honestly. That was the truest thing anyone in my family had said to me in years. It was also the saddest. She told me that my mother had been telling relatives I had cut the family off over a joke. That my aunt had stopped speaking to my uncle over who had known what about the estate. That Mark had started blaming my sister for the whole situation because if Christmas had gone better, none of this would have happened. She said the house felt like a building with a cracked foundation that everyone was still insisting was fine because they didn't want to deal with what fixing it would cost. She started crying then, the plain kind, tired and ashamed. She said she didn't know how to fix any of it. I told her, you don't fix years in one coffee. You tell the truth and then you choose differently. We sat for a while after that without anything to say. I paid the check. At the door, she put her hand briefly on my arm and said, I'm sorry about dinner, about all of it, not just Christmas. I believed her. I also knew that believing someone and trusting them are different things, and that trust was going to require evidence and time. And that the thing she was apologizing for had not started at Christmas dinner, only arrived there. The pressure from the rest of the family continued. My aunt sent a formal letter, which was almost impressive in its attempt to sound both aggrieved and reasonable. My uncle called 3 times in 1 week, and the third voicemail ended with something about my grandmother not wanting to tear the family apart, which was a creative interpretation of what the letter I held in my hands had actually said. My mother sent a series of messages that moved through the stages of grief in the wrong order and arrived, eventually, at something I hadn't expected. On a Sunday evening, she sent a message that was different from the others. No requests, no mentions of the estate, no reference to Christmas. She wrote, "I think I have always believed that the way we talked about your life was honest, that it was helpful. I'm starting to understand that what I thought was honesty was just permission to be unkind." I read that 3 times. Then I set the phone down and made dinner and came back to it. I met with Patricia Osei again in March, this time alone, to review the full scope of my responsibilities and my options. She explained them clearly and without pressure. I was not required to distribute anything. I was not required to sell the property. I was required to manage the trust in good faith, which was defined as the interest of the trust, not the emotional interest of adults with their own financial decisions. I asked her what my grandmother had said when she'd set this up. Patricia considered that for a moment. She said your grandmother had told her that every family has one person who is expected to manage everyone else's comfort at the cost of their own, and that she had watched that happen to you for 30 years. And she wasn't going to let her death become another thing you were expected to absorb quietly. I drove home with the windows down, even though it was only March, and still cold, and thought about my grandmother in her hospital room the previous winter, holding my hand, telling me I was the one she didn't worry about. She had been building something for me while she was telling me that. I spent the last week of March going through the trust documents carefully, taking my time, because my grandmother had asked me to do something useful, rather than something urgent, and I intended to honor that. I decided a portion of the annual rental income would go toward a small emergency fund for renters in our county facing eviction, administered through a housing nonprofit I had found and vetted. Something my grandmother, who had rented her entire adult life before buying that duplex, would have understood without needing to have it explained. The rest I would manage conservatively, the way she had managed the property itself, with patience, without panic. I did not distribute anything to my family. I sent my mother a response to her Sunday message. I said that I had heard her. I said that the apology meant something to me. I said that rebuilding a relationship would take time, and that the time would require her to stop making my life choices into the punchline of whatever tension was in the room. I said I was willing to try, slowly, with clear terms. I said I would not be discussing the trust as part of any family conversation, and that if it came up, I would end the conversation immediately. She wrote back 2 days later. She said okay. She said she understood. She said she missed me. I wasn't ready to say I missed her. I wasn't sure yet whether what I missed was her or the idea of a version of her that had always been a little aspirational. But I was willing to keep the door open at a size that felt safe to me, not a size that felt adequate to everyone else. My brother-in-law never reached out directly. My sister told me in April that he had tried to get her to ask me to drop the situation, which was his way of wanting resolution without accountability, and she had told him no. That was new. That was different. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed. My niece, on a Saturday in late spring, when my sister and I were trying a slow version of something, like a normal afternoon, asked me if I was done being mad at Christmas. I thought about how to answer a 7-year-old honestly, without making her carry weight that wasn't hers. I said I wasn't really mad anymore. I said sometimes grown-ups have to figure out how to be better at being a family, and that takes time, and it's not anything she needed to worry about. She said, "I didn't think what Daddy said was very funny." I said I didn't think so either. She went back to her drawing. I sat with that for a moment. That small, uncomplicated justice, a child knowing the difference between a joke and a wound, and thought about how much easier things might have been if the adults at that table had managed the same. I did not go home for Easter. I spent it with Jade and a group of her friends at a potluck in someone's backyard, sitting on folding chairs with paper plates and too much food, talking about nothing in particular, watching the light change in the late afternoon. Nobody asked me to justify my choices. Nobody measured my apartment with a tone. Nobody said almost 30 the way people say almost out of time. I drove home with the radio on, and the windows down, and the particular feeling of someone who has been cold for a long time and is finally learning to recognize warmth. My apartment is small. My family would still call it that if they saw it, though I think they might say it differently now. The bookshelf is secondhand. The rug by the door I bought on clearance. The plants on the window ledge I've kept alive for 2 years, which is the longest streak I've ever managed, and which feels like evidence of something I can't quite name. The contract work fills my days in a way that is quiet and demanding, and mine in a way I didn't have language for, until I understood what it had cost me to let other people's contempt into the room where I worked. I am not finished with my family. I'm not sure what finished would even mean. But I am finished with the version of myself that arrived at every gathering already apologizing for the space I occupied. My grandmother left me more than a property. She left me a record of being seen accurately by someone who did not need me to be smaller in order to feel comfortable. That is not a small thing. That is almost the whole thing. She wrote to me that I had earned something that had nothing to do with the property. I think I know what she meant now. She meant that I had been paying into a system my entire adult life that was never going to pay out, and that the kindest thing she could do was give me a reason to stop. I didn't need the trust to walk out of that Christmas dinner. I had been building toward that door for years, but sometimes you need someone to confirm from the outside what you've been telling yourself in the dark, and my grandmother, in her small, deliberate handwriting, in a letter she had prepared for a moment she wouldn't be alive to see, had done exactly that. Tell me in the comments, if you had been at that table, would you have stayed? Would you have said something? And here's the harder question. How long would it have taken you to understand that the problem wasn't the joke? It was the room that kept making space for it. Because the thing I kept coming back to, in all those months of distance, and quiet, and slowly learning what it felt like to take up space without permission, it was never about one dinner. One dinner is just the night the building finally shows you the crack it has been hiding. You can patch it and pretend, the way my family wanted to. Or you can finally stop living inside a structure that was never built with your safety in mind. I chose the second one. And for the first time in my adult life, I am not waiting to find out if that was the right call. I already know,